This is, of course, we had this discussion earlier. Jesse brought up some of the things about cognitive science and some of the discussions we've had in the cognitive science reading group. This is a, a, a paper. I think it's from a book, I'm not quite sure. This is The Challenge of Cognitive Science. And it kind of talks about cognitive science as an interdisciplinary endeavor, the contrast between psychology and neuroscience, and then the challenge of cognitive science. So we've read a number of papers in which cognitive science is defined, and then the history of cognitive science is defined as sort of the quest towards that definition. One of the problems of cognitive science is because it uses so many different tools and techniques, it stretches over so many input disciplines, is that it's hard to really kind of get a good sort of distilled sense of what cognitive science is. So it's an area of inquiry, but there's so much going on that's so diverse that it's hard to kind of, if you were to boil it down to a couple of important studies, how are those studies connected? It's very hard to see the sort of the pattern there. And then furthermore, like we've said, over time, there's been this sort of evolution in cognitive science from you know, basic decision making to, psychophysics to AI and large language models and things like that. So there is this space of cognitive science, but how much is any one approach providing at any given time? So, of course, we start with the hexagonal diagram, and this was something that came from a 1978 report on the state of the art in cognitive science that was commissioned by the Sloan Foundation. So that's where we reference this cognitive science hexagon, and it's just a shape that describes sort of the space in between six input disciplines. And you'll see different disciplines, actually, if you look up the cognitive science pyramid on, if you Google it or something and you look up the different references, they sometimes have different names for the disciplines that are contributing, which is, it's kind of slippery in that sense. So it's kind of hard to define this triangle or this hexagon or even any triangle within the hexagon properly, because if you're not using the precise terms, then it's a different field. So we have philosophy, which is a huge territory of things. I think largely in the philosophy that's contributing to cognitive science is largely philosophy of mind, although there are other parts of philosophy that can contribute as well. There's linguistics. So our focus on large language models isn't just kind of without precedent. There have always been linguists in the cognitive science enterprise, and the LLMs are the latest sort of version of that. There's anthropology, which in some ways contributes to cognitive science. A lot of the cognition in the wild work, and a lot of the situated cognition work is based in, at least in part, in anthropology. There's also thinking about human evolution and the evolution of cognition as well. There's neuroscience, of course. Again, these are all very large fields, so some parts contribute, and but it's, I guess, the spirit of the field. That's really what when they came up with this hexagon, is what they were thinking. So there's neuroscience, which of course is where we're thinking about neural circuits, and comparative cognition, but also sort of these broader questions of function. Then there's artificial intelligence. Sometimes you'll see computer science as this point in the hexagon. Artificial intelligence being the classical symbol manipulation artificial intelligence. But I think that still kind of fits in there as an area. And then psychology, cognitive psychology, which a lot of times people will conflate cognitive psychology with cognitive science. And of course, they're not the same thing. Now, within this hexagon, you have these triangles. So you have like a triangle between psychology, linguistics, and anthropology, or psychology, linguistics, and neuroscience, or artificial intelligence, philosophy, and anthropology. So you could recombine these in different ways depending on the question you're asking. So this is a very interdisciplinary field, and it's when they came up with the hexagon, they described cognitive science as an amalgamation of all these fields. And I don't really think the amalgamation aspect is quite correct. It's more like maybe it's inspired by different fields. So depending on the question you're asking, you're maybe drawing from those different fields, knowledge and tools and things like that. So that's kind of what I think we're kind of going with respect to cognitive science. And you can imagine that when you have so many influences that sometimes the field is incoherent, and that led to papers like Whatever Happened to Cognitive Science that we've talked about a lot, and just kind of people wondering what the state of the field is. So this is just kind of thinking about this in different, in this way. Some of the connections identified in the cognitive science hexagon were judged stronger than others. So we have dotted lines and solid lines. The solid lines are the more solid connections. The dotted lines are the more ephemeral connections. But nevertheless, these are all connections to be made. So it kind of, gives you an idea of where the bulk of the work is and where maybe lesser work is happening. This is kind of an interesting point. Some of the connections that were judged weak in 1978 has now become a thriving subdiscipline in its own right. Some philosophers, impressed by the potential for fruitful dialogue between philosophy and neuroscience, have taken to calling themselves neurophilosophers. So this started with Patricia Churchland's work in 1986 and has moved forward in a lot of the stuff that people have done on the philosophy of mind. So there's been a lot of work on, what was the book that, it's Reality Plus. That was a philosophical take on virtual reality and sort of a lot of the cognitive science issues in that area.
I think, is that the one that Hussein did a review of a long time
Yeah,
ago?
Hussein did a review on that.
It's like by Chalmers, I think, or something.
Yeah, Chalmers. So again, this is, if you have a cognitive science talk series, you will get talks like that, and then you'll get talks on, using fMRI for human categorization, and then you might get a talk on comparative cognition between humans and, like other mammals or other animals. And, so it's a very diverse area. And the idea is that you should be able to extract sort of the commonalities between all these approaches. And so, okay, so this is a nice anecdotal story. Miller's account of how the Sloan report was written is both disarming and telling. The committee met once in Kansas City. It quickly became apparent that everyone knew his own field and has heard of 2 or 3 interesting findings in other fields. After hours of discussion, experts in discipline X were unwilling to make any judgments about discipline Y, and so forth. In the end, they did what they were competent to do. Each summarized his or her own field, and the editors of the volume patched together a report. This may be how reports get written, but it's not a very good model for an interdisciplinary enterprise such as cognitive science. So what he's saying is that they came up with this hexagon quite simply by asking people, what is your field? How do you think that they connect? And then kind of putting that all together. I would have thought it maybe would have been validated by a literature mining exercise, but apparently not. So who knows?
It's it's kind of funny how much like, and this is like the major thesis of like a lot of the stuff. Like, why am I making? I'm sorry to just tangent this so much, but like, what's motivating me so much in many of the things that I'm doing right now is like that's. Thank you for the paper, Bradley, or the
Yeah,
book
yeah,
chapter, because this is exactly in the service of like uh so many things that are the way they are right now are kind of exist in the context of um I'm gonna very briefly share this, but like this is a broader concept of this is 20th century dreams or whatever, and this is a bit of a social commentary on it, but the same's true for like the DSM. Like how these things, like all these things, why I'm doing what I'm calling like person studies or agentic studies, or I'm trying to come up with a new term for this cross whatever, cross domain looking at some aspects of science, what we call cognitive science, cognition, phenomenology, whatnot. Is like, where does it come from? Well, a lot of like the bedrock foundations and demarcations of things are literally just, well, hey, here's like an arrangement of some stuff that's how what when we first made it, we put the structural logic of the thing together in this particular configuration, and we just built on it because it's something to do. And I don't begrudge it, as this is like my it's a very common soapbox for me. I don't begrudge that it happened. That's like when you're building something, when you're building new ground, just like we said about the Van Gelder paper earlier. I said the sympathy of Van Gelder making a somewhat contrived argument that he knew would be corrected upon later. Like that's a great thing to do and a difficult thing to do, especially when you know you could be perfect. You have to start somewhere. So immense sympathy for that. Like I'm not trying to shame, oh, how stupid the people were who made cognitive science. Well, you have to start there. But the thing is, like, I feel like we're in this era right now where it's so vital that we really investigate the configure like the the original structural configuration of the field and everything else versus not having to be beholden to the legacy configuration forever. And I think there's so much tension there, and there's new things emerging, but it's also like, you know, where's the path dependency of it all taking place? So we can go back to this, but like I appreciate you bringing it up, and I've had my little my tantrum about it. But I think articulating these, a lot of the work I'm trying to do in the future center in many ways is articulate ways of looking philosophy, history of science, meta-science, sure, where these domains developed and why they did or didn't go in a direction. I know we have that in Cognition Futures. I know it's a major part of reimagining cybernetics or reconstructing cybernetics as sort of our in-house Orel initiative. But there's just so much there, and I think this will be a good another another tally on that board.
yeah. So, in light of what you're saying, then the next part of this paper is, in fact, the hexagon as a whole is not a very good model for cognitive science. So, this is kind of the take home here is that, we have this model that everyone cites, and then they wonder what happened to cognitive science, but in fact, it maybe isn't a good descriptive model after all. Even if we take seriously the lines that mark connections between the disciplines of cognitive science, the hexagon gives no sense of a unified intellectual enterprise. It gives no sense, that is, of something that is more of a composite of traditional disciplines such as philosophy and psychology. There are many different schools of philosophy, many different specializations within psychology, but there are certain things that bind together philosophers as a group and psychologists as a group, irrespective of their school and specialization. Um, And so, one of the main claims of this textbook is that cognitive science is indeed a unified enterprise. That it has its own distinctive problems, techniques, and explanatory frameworks. And so, what we need isn't necessarily a hexagon, but to figure out what's going inside this hexagon, irrespective of the different contributing fields. So, there are a lot of contributing fields in cognitive science. I mean, if you think about like the earliest artificial intelligence research, you had people who were interested in psychology, but also interested in computer science, which actually at the time wasn't really a unified field. It was just like a department at a university that grew out of the math department where they did things on computers and they were developing sort of their own methodologies. But you'd use those then to move to some, work in trying to program machines that learned, like you might see in a psychology experiment. There's a story about how um, so there was a department at the University of Michigan that was founded by John Holland, and it was the precursor to the modern complexity um, program at U of M. And there's a story about how John Holland was kind of in this space. He was like interested in psychology, interested in computer science, and wanted to bring them together into a program that people could, learn how to do things. And it was kind of like an adaptive computing, adaptive behavior type idea, but it was very fluid. And so it had influences and it would have eventually its own questions. But it was like, how do we sort of set this apart from all the other things going on at the university? And that's true of a lot of things that are kind of emerging and how programs form and how they have to justify themselves within the university. As Jesse said, there's this inertial aspect where you have to report to institutions that want to keep doing things a certain way, but also want to see kind of how things fit into their prior framework for doing things. And so this is kind of the problem with cognitive science, right? What is defining cognitive science? And so this is where they kind of get into some of the things about that make cognitive science unique. There's, of course, the levels of explanation. So the levels of explanation in cognitive science are different than neuroscience, but actually different than psychology as well, because most cognitive scientists will place the study of the brain firmly at the heart of cognitive science, but it's not at the level of neuroscience. Cognitive scientists, by and large, don't care about, say, molecular mechanisms in the brain. They don't think in terms of circuits so much. They do think in terms of what happens in the brain, then linking that to the sort of these cognitive mechanisms or behaviors. Whereas psychology doesn't necessarily think about mechanisms, although depending on where you are in a psychology department, you think about that more or less. So, again, part of this is in that cognitive science has its own unique take on, what you're investigating. But then again, you go to a psychology department and you can find someone who's very much aligned with the cognitive science program and not really be a cognitive scientist or more of a cognitive psychologist. So it's very much, that's one of the problems, is that it's very much like, it's so broad that it's kind of bringing in things that sometimes do belong to other fields or that are concurrent with other fields. So this just shows the levels of explanation where you have, people are interested in what happens from neurons to pathways to cognition. And then this is a nice figure. This is, I think I've shown this figure before. This shows different modes of investigation for the temporal length of some phenomena of the brain versus the size of its phenomena. So, like, If you're looking at a synapse versus the whole brain, that's a difference in terms of size in millimeters. Or if you're looking at something that happens at a millisecond versus a day, there's this difference in time in terms of seconds. And all these, this is just a list of these different methods that are used to measure those time scales and those length scales. So, like patch clamp is something you use on a neuron to measure electrical activity, and that happens at a certain time scale. That's very different from, say, like lesion studies or fMRI. And then you could make this kind of graph, in fact, for a lot of things, not just for methods for measuring activity, but also for behaviors. And I think we have in one of our papers a map where we have like a time scale for different
Yeah,
aspects of cognition. Yeah.
that's what I was thinking of when I saw this, and I couldn't remember which one it was. So I was also going to say, like, definitely, if you can put this paper in this chapter in a Slack, I definitely want to, because this is a nice introduction for a lot of, for like some other folks that are kind of coming into some of the cognition future stuff. This is, it's a nice, like, I'm glad we're getting like the methodology, like this is sort of the methodology of the, cognition futures method project stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's this challenge of cognitive science. There, the three dimensions of variation. So, one dimension of variation is illustrated by the subfields of neuroscience. Neuroscience studies the brain at many different levels. And in neuroscience, they adopt the vertical hierarchy of biology. So, you go from neurons to brains to societies, and you can look at all those things in neuroscience. And of course, so that's something that cognitive science kind of adopts to some extent. Um, then the second dimension of variation comes from the different techniques and tools, which we saw in that figure, that are used at different time and length scales. And of course, the third dimension of variation is exemplified by the different subfields of psychology. So we might want to go out and explore, map, and describe and explain the cognitive abilities, making it possible to myriad things that human beings do and say. So, you have in psychology, you have different subfields like developmental, clinical, cognitive, psychiatry, all these different areas of psychology. And people are just interested in largely in the same thing. They're just interested in different ways of looking at it. So and then that, of course, is something, all things that we can adopt into cognitive science. And then they have this figure here, which is the space of cognitive science. This graph is not as informative as I would have liked it to be, but basically, it kind of shows these different modes of inquiry: vision, memory, language, problem solving, and then these other things that are not specified. And then that's the x-axis. The y-axis are the different methods for getting at these things. So like fMRI, behavioral data, and some neurophysiological recordings down here. And then, of course, you have the levels of organization: molecules, synapses, neurons, networks, the central nervous system on the z-axis. So it's this three-dimensional plot: investigative technique, levels of organization, and domains of cognition. And then the idea is you could plot out your study or your area of interest as a space or as a dot in this space. And that defines your interest in cognitive science, I guess. So it's just kind of breaking ourselves out of that hexagon and thinking in different ways about how to define cognitive science. So it's good stuff. And then this is just as the preface to a book, and this goes through, and I think this stops here at the prehistory of cognitive science, which is another story for another day.